The cake slapped Michael Reed's cheek like a public accusation. Cameras swung. Laughter spread through the room like wildfire. Emily Whitman smiled as if she had already won. Jonathan stared at his phone and would not look up. A message buzzed. The foundation was taking another look. Michael felt $4 billion shift under his feet. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The note was small, the kind of scrap you tuck into a wallet and forget until it peels at the edges. Michael held it now, under the harsh light of the men's room mirror. The handwriting, a hurried scrawl he knew by heart. Remember why you built this. He read it twice, the words a steadying pulse against a night that felt like glass. Beautiful, sharp, and liable to cut. Outside, the gala hummed like a living thing. The ballroom sat high above the city, a bowl of warm light and polished wood that made the skyline look like something humble and distant. Crystal chandeliers scattered themselves into a million soft suns. There was the perfume of lilies, the dry citrus of champagne, the thicker sweetness of buttercream from the dessert table. An invisible map of the evening. People skimmed each other like stones across water. Greetings, business cards, smiles practiced to the point of dullness. He smoothed his cuff, a small motion borrowed from rehearsed confidence. To the cameras and the donors and the board members, Michael Reed was a figure carved from a single block of success. Steady, unruffled, worthy of the headline portraits. The truth said elsewise, threaded through the bones of him. He had been a farm boy once, the son of a woman who could coax good tomatoes out of bad soil, who woke at dawn and never let him cry in front of customers. He had a ledger of favors and debts, a series of quiet bargains that had shaped his ascent. He carried them like coins in his pocket, useful, heavy, impossible to discard. Up close in that mirror, his face betrayed more than the suit could hide. Lines lived at the corners of his mouth now that had not been earned by laughter alone. There was a small scar above his brow from a childhood bicycle fall, a nick that, in every photograph, softened his jaw into something unexpectedly vulnerable. His hands betrayed the work, large and precise, with knuckles that remembered the weight of more than decision. He pressed his palms flat to the sink and let the light revise him into something resembling the man he wanted the world to see. The narrator chooses to be kind here because kindness, for a man like Michael, was not a weakness but a strategy. He remembered how his mother taught him to say thank you even when someone knocked the wind out of him, how gratitude could disarm greed. But the observer in the room held its breath, silent and clear. This night would not be about gratitude alone. There was something electric in the air, a pressure like before lightning. He left the mirror and walked back into the noise, the room folding around him like a stage. Laughter telescoped. Near the head table, a string quartet played music that promised things were under control. Men in tuxedos talked about mergers as though they were agreeable weather, forecastable and unthreatening. Women in gowns leaned into trade secrets that weighed in stock prices. Michael's suit was expensive but unobtrusive, designed to do its work without asking for applause. He moved through it with the practiced economy of someone who had learned to be unremarkable in order to be accepted. His phone vibrated, a single message from Jonathan, his chief counsel. 2 words, no punctuation. Tonight. Close. Michael's thumb hovered, then withdrew. He felt the phrase settle in his chest like a stone. The board wanted the deal signed before the end of the week, a consolidated acquisition that would push his company, Viridian, into a new league, one of those rarefied billion-dollar breathings. For $1 billion. The number hung in the air, impossible and clean. It promised power, research funded, communities employed, debts repaid. It promised the quiet victory his mother would neither advertise nor celebrate. But it also promised new hands on the wheel, new faces in the boardroom. He found a wooden table near the terrace. The night air hit him like silk, cool, sharp with the scent of rain that might come later. He watched the city move below, lights trembling like a field of fireflies, taxis weaving like stitches. In the corner of the terrace, a band of younger donors smoked and traded stories in soft, urgent voices. There were children who would inherit the futures being negotiated in that ballroom. Children he wanted to protect, even if protecting them meant playing games he had never wanted to learn. Michael's life had been a steady climb toward this moment, not for glory, but for a single stubborn belief that a company could be more than a ledger. That wealth, folded and unfolded in the right ways, could build more than mansions. He wanted something else for the neighborhoods he came from, clean parks that stayed clean, schools with libraries that smelled like books and not bleach, jobs that paid more than survival. He had punctured the glass ceiling with appointments and proposals, and a willingness to sit at tables where he felt conspicuously different. He had learned to let compliments bounce off him, to hold his face smooth while the currents around him tested his footing. A woman laughed somewhere to his left, high and bright as a bell. Michael turned and saw her by the cake table, tall, pale, the kind of presence that the cameras loved to linger on. She wore a white dress that seemed cut from the moon, layered, expensive, and decidedly untroubled. Her laughter was a practice thing, but her eyes were quick and evaluative. She had the ease of inherited certainty. The room behaved for her in the ways rooms behave for those born into a steady stream of privilege. Her name, he had heard, was Emily Whitman. She was the heiress, the kind whispered about at charity auctions, the kind who could tip a company's fate with an introduction or a tremor of disapproval. She smiled now at a man who had just paid her a compliment about the dessert, and the crowd swiveled in sympathetic focus. Michael felt the attention. No, not attention exactly, more like the gravitational pull of an experiment about to begin. There was a flutter in his chest that was not entirely fear. It was curiosity lined with a careful caution. The narrator steps back, now impartial, to name what is visible. Michael had everything that patience, smart choices, and sleepless nights could buy. He had a sleek office and an elegant truth that the world could be remade. He also had the uneasy sense that any success large enough to be measured in billions would attract, whether admirers, yes, but also those who would test him in public to mark his place. He knew the histories people carried, the small brutalities disguised as jokes at cocktail parties, the ways old money could wrap humiliation in silk. Inside, he rehearsed the speech he would give later, grateful, forward-looking, tethered to the people who had lifted him. He practiced a smile that would not crack when questions landed, like hail. He was used to performing calmly, but he felt tonight like a man balancing on a beam with a storm gathering. Hands out, steady breath, eyes forward. Far from the boardroom speculations and the polite clink of glasses, a server carried a tray of miniature cakes, the frosting sculpted into petals. Michael watched as a hand, ornate, manicured, reached from the crowd. The human eye looks for patterns. He looked for the edge where things might go wrong. He did not yet know the particular cruelty that would come as delicately as icing, nor did he know the precise shape of the bargain that would be struck in the minutes to follow. What he did know was this: tonight would demand of him a face and a choice, and that the small note folded and worn in his pocket, "Remember why you built this," would do more than comfort him. It might be an instruction, or it might be a test. The cake landed like a soft, deliberate betrayal. It began as a joke, the kind that moves through rooms like a rumor, light, a little dangerous, and somehow contagious. Emily Whitman stepped forward with the ease of someone who had never needed permission to take center stage. She reached for a slice, then, with a flash of mischief that was practiced and sharp, she pressed the frosting against Michael's cheek. It smeared white and ridiculous across his jaw. For a single beat, the room held its breath. Michael's first instinct was to laugh. He had practiced smiling through worse. Polished panels and pointed questions had taught him how to return a blow with a curve of warmth. His hand went to his face, and came away with frosting on his fingertips. Cameras swiveled. Someone laughed, too loud, a bark that slipped into cruel territory. The string quartet faltered, and a fork clinked against a plate like a small alarm. The narrator leans closer, tender. Humiliation is a hot, ugly thing, and it burns differently when it is spread by someone who could have helped. Michael felt the light tilt. He felt it in his stomach first, a cold that had nothing to do with dessert. The public is a weather system of its own. When it shifts, it moves fast. In the minutes of that shift, reputations fork. Emily wiped her hands on the skirt of her dress, as if she had returned a favor. Her smile was bright and edged with calculation. She was beautiful in a way that made people feel both blessed and watched. She said something to the man beside her, something quiet, a private joke delivered in a loud room, and the man's face changed a fraction. The cameras drank it up. The murmurs became a tide. The observer's voice, dry and clear, notices the architecture of power. Emily's family name sat like an accent in the room. Whitman. Whitman Holdings held sway over ventures, over boardrooms, over the kinds of introductions that turned into billion-dollar signatures. Emily herself did not need to sign papers. She performed influence. A tilt of her head, a folded eyebrow, a private laugh, each was currency. Michael's hands were steady. He set his shoulders and moved as though nothing had happened. He answered a toast when someone clinked a glass near him, and his voice found the pitch he reserved for hallways and headlines. The cameras liked him then, too, serious, composed, the kind of steadiness reporters call leadership. But the frosting at the seam of his jaw kept the world on a different axis. People remember the small blemishes more quickly than the long virtues. In the minutes that followed, whispers braided into pattern. Was that staged? Someone asked. What did she mean by that? Another murmured. A woman near the head table smoothed her gloves, as if rearranging herself for the spectacle. Phones surfaced. Clips began to circulate. 10 seconds that might live forever. Jonathan's text arrived like a stone in a pond. Where are you? Call. Michael thumbed a reply with the same practiced calm he used at meetings. On terrace. He didn't mention the frosting. He didn't want to feed the moment with panic. But he felt it. The way the room had shifted and how quickly influence could transmogrify into a threat. He felt the fear that a joke could be engineered to be something else entirely. There is a quiet cruelty in public theater that the private world rarely sees. The narrator, compassionate now, lets the reader feel how such an act sinks teeth into a person who has bled to build something. Michael had spent years building Viridian not to be a target of mockery, but to be a conduit of jobs, of libraries, of the minor miracles of steady neighborhoods. That a young heiress could make his dignity a prop in a room full of cameras hit him in a way that money could not soften. Minutes later, the prank began to fold into consequence. Emily lifted her glass with a practiced, slow motion and addressed the room. Her voice was clear, amused. She told a story about charity and values, about how important it was for investors to match the face of a company with its purpose. It read like a speech written by someone fluent in the language of influence. She named the Whitman Foundation's priorities, spoke of brand alignment and public trust. Her words were careful. They were lethal. The observer notes the movement. A sentence deployed at the right moment can be a hinge. Emily's final line, light, courteous, delivered with a smile that did not touch her eyes, was that the Whitman family and its foundation wanted to reassess their partnerships before making any decisions. The cameras found that line and held it as if it were a headline. Michael heard it as if from underwater. Reassess. Reassess meant delay. Delay could be a polite way to halt momentum. Reassess could mean wait and see for the rest of the room, and pull support where it mattered most. The Whitman vote was not a rumor, it was a lever. If Whitman Holdings withdrew backing, a $4 billion consolidation could collapse like a house of cards. The sense of betrayal arrived like a draft through a closed window. It was not a direct accusation, not a shouted line of reason. It was a small public act and a careful phrase, coupled together. The two-voiced narrative steps back now. One voice holds Michael's hurt like a secret. The other calculates the ripples. The combination is a weapon often missed by those who watch only the surface. Someone at the head table tapped a tablet, and a press release began to thread into the room's feeds. Whitman Foundation to reassess strategic partnerships. No further comment. A hush fell that was not mourning, but calculation. Reporters leaned forward. Investors who had been murmuring comfortably now exchanged looks that weighed dollars and leverage. The joke, whether intended or not, had become an opening wedge. Michael's mouth was a closed line. He could feel the crowd recalibrating. It was as if the frosting had not only marked him, but had made visible a fracture no one had named. He thought briefly, sharply, of the note in his wallet. Remember why you built this. The memory steadied him. If he let panic seed his face, if he showed the quick anger that sometimes rose when he was provoked, he knew the room would eat it alive. Emily laughed again, low enough to be intimate, loud enough to be a spectacle. Her laugh hung in the air like the echo of someone who had already scored a point. The man beside her, a Whitman executive whose nods had sealed quiet priorities for years, caught her eye and mouthed something. The lips were unreadable, but the motion was an agreement. A camera flashed. Michael took the world in. The reporters, the donors, the servers hovering like ghosts with platters, the thin places where influence touched outcome. He imagined the headlines that would slice tomorrow's morning. CEO humiliated at gala. Whitman reassesses deal. He tried for a moment to find humor. What an absurd, modern tragedy. A man built from dirt and ledger, brought low by cake. But humor bent quickly into something harder. The knowledge that public perception could be engineered. Jonathan appeared at the terrace steps, urgency in his stride. His face was a map of lines he had not had before. Counsel had to be fast now. Mike, he said, voice clipped. We need to move. The press is, he did not finish. He did not need to. The word unsaid hung like a verdict. The narrator, impartial, maps the consequences. Power is not always blunt. It often hides in manners, in timing. Emily's act might have been a childish jest. It might have been cruelty without a plan. Or it might have been designed to reveal a fault line and then exploit it. The difference between a prank and a provocation is whether the instigator can use the reaction. The Whitman name had that capacity. Michael folded the cloth napkin into his palm. He felt its soft weight, the granules of sugar trapped in the weave. He imagined the meeting rooms where signatures were slated to go down in a week's time. He imagined a room of men and women recalculating risk against spectacle. And he felt like a heat rising from steel, the sense of being tested. The final act of the scene comes small, a text from an unknown sender to the event's media list. Whitman Foundation statement attached. Michael's phone buzzed with a flurry. He read the first line, and the first word settled like ice. Whitman Foundation will be reassessing its participation in the proposed merger. No further comment. It was brief, sterile, and what it did was clear. It paused everything that depended on Whitman's backing. He stood there on the terrace, frosting still drying at the edge of his jaw, and for the first time in a long while he felt the thinness of his position in a room full of money. The note in his pocket seemed suddenly louder. Remember why you built this. The narrator softens. There is an injustice in being humiliated, yes. But there is also the quiet truth that great stakes attract small cruelties. Michael had to decide, then and there, whether to let the scene define him, or to let the coal in his palm become a burn that refines rather than ruins. The night had broken the surface of his calm. Now it was revealing what lay under. Alliances he had not yet made, enemies he had not expected, and the shape of a betrayal that had not yet fully named itself. The morning after the gala felt like a bruise, dull, tender, impossible to ignore. Michael woke before his alarm, the room still in the soft gray of early light. He could feel the memory of the frosting on his cheek like a ghost touch. He sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet settle, letting the steady breath of the city seep through the window. The note in his wallet, "Remember why you built this," rested under his palm as if it were small armor. Jonathan arrived at the office with the kind of face that shows where counsel has been burning the night before. He looked older in a way that no mirror can measure. Lines mended worry, the tiny way a man learns how to bend without breaking. He held a coffee like a talisman and did not sit immediately. He scanned Michael from across the glass-walled boardroom, and then, like a man who draws breath before speaking badly needed truth, he said, "We need to move fast." Whitman's statement went global by 3 o'clock. Investors are asking questions. "How bad is bad?" Michael asked. He folded his hands to keep them still, gesture trained to signal calm. Inside, his stomach was a drum. Jonathan's voice tightened. "We could lose the financing window. Whitman not only pulls money, they shape the market's confidence. If they delay, others will follow the write down." He paused. "There are calls from our legal partners asking if we've considered contingency financing. They want options." Michael wanted to be purely the steady leader. He forced the smile he kept in reserve and said, "Then we find options. We explain. We show them why Viridian matters beyond a moment's theater." Jonathan met his eyes for a long second, and something moved in that look that Michael could not fully name. Sympathy, calculation, a past that loosened at the edges. "There's another thing," Jonathan said finally, softer. "I ran the gala footage again. There are 2 angles we didn't notice until late. In one, a man gestures to Emily before she walks to the cake. He's not Whitman's staff. He's an outside consultant. In another, she murmurs into her phone right after. I can pull the audio." Michael's throat tightened. The world had become a set of images and sounds that could be replayed and weaponized. "Pull it," he said. Now, they worked like men dismantling a machine to understand its failure. The footage showed a tiny choreography, Emily's laugh, the reach to cake, the smear of frosting, and then a hand at the edge of the frame, a man who nodded like someone closing a circuit. Jonathan leaned back once the audio came through, a soft click, then a whisper inaudible to most ears, but clear in the clean file. Signal given. He exhaled. This was planned. Michael felt the floor under his feet shift. The narrator, now Kinder, notes that betrayal often moves in well-rehearsed steps. Michael's mind, practical and hungry for truth, cataloged possibilities. Public humiliation as leverage, a show to test his temper, a trap to freeze confidence. Each possibility was a weight. At midday, he called his sister, Rachel. Hearing her voice steadied him, as it had when they were children and the world was smaller. She did not ask about the gala. She asked first about how he slept, what he ate. That small care cut through the boardroom's cold mathematics. "You are always too soft for some of these rooms," Rachel said after he described the incident. She had her mother's hands and a directness Michael admired. But softness is not wrong. Don't let their cruelty become a mirror for you. He listened, grateful. Her words anchored him and revealed the deeper fault line. Michael had, for years, softened edges when it mattered, making sure that when deals bent, people did not break. That way of moving through the world had won him loyal employees and quiet gratitude. It had also made him vulnerable to those who measured power only by how quickly they could unbalance a table. Across town, Emily sat in her family study where oil paintings kept their watch and afternoon light fell in carved bars. She was not untouched by the ripple she had caused. Her hands trembled slightly as she read a string of messages. Her father, Richard Whitman, had texted 2 words, "Well played." Her mother had sent a note of congratulations, a silvered emoji, and nothing more. But the rest of the room for her was practice. An inheritance of ritual where influence was practiced like an instrument and mistakes were rare. A close narrator's voice leans in. Emily had reasons, and those reasons were not simple. She loved power in ways that were both raw and cultivated. She had been taught that influence was a stewardship, and in that doctrine she believed she was acting for the greater good. But there was also the private fact. Whitman Holdings had watched Viridian's rise with an analyst's hunger. The company's CSR programs spoke to Emily's curated world. She had been presented with glossy proposals and promises. The gala was a stage, and she had chosen to put a pin in a particular balloon. At lunch, Emily met with Daniel Price, a slim man who consulted for the foundation. His words were measured and dangerous in their calm. "You gave him pause," he said, fingers folded. "Our donors will appreciate the caution. We signal that we require alignment." "Alignment," Emily echoed. She tasted the word. She imagined the structures she thought she could fix by steering money, by withdrawing it when values did not match. Sometimes she believed she was saving institutions by pruning them. Sometimes she sensed she was testing them, watching to see who would fold and who would stand upright. In her private mirror, she justified the humiliation as a necessary cruelty. Back at Viridian, tensions gathered like weather. Laura Chun, the CFO, called a rapid meeting. She was practical, a woman who measured risk with a surgeon's attention. "We need a counter-narrative," she insisted. "We prepare a statement showing our commitments, community contracts, milestones. We line up partner letters." Her voice was brisk. Her eyes avoided Michael's, not from disrespect, but from the calculation of survival. "It will help," Jonathan agreed, fingers steepled. "But it won't replace the Whitman vote. We need to reach them. We need a conversation with Richard Whitman himself." Michael considered the task and realized how small and vast the gesture would be. Small because he would ask for a meeting. Vast because the meeting could decide more than money. It could decide whether his work would be measured by a single public humiliation or by the slow architecture of the changes he had tried to build. He felt the old, familiar ache, wanting to be proved right not for ego's sake, but because other people's futures had been folded into his plans. That night, he returned to the terrace where the city hummed with indifferent light. He thought of Emily's laugh and the man who had signaled from the edge. He thought of Rachel's kindness and Jonathan's strained counsel. He thought of Laura's plans and the small, stubborn muscle in his chest that refused to fold. In the quiet of that terrace, the narrator shifts to impartial observation. Alliances now reconfigure themselves. Some people rallied to him, loyal employees who had seen him in hard places and chosen to stay. Others drifted, calculating survival. A few watched for the better position in a world that loved to reward second chances. What had been a single moment of humiliation had turned into a test of character for everyone around him. Before he left, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Are you sure you want to play fair?" The text was simple and oddly intimate, like a hand placed on his shoulder in a crowded room. Michael read it twice. The message had no signature. It felt like a provocation. He folded the phone back into his pocket. The choice stretched in front of him as a road, a clean line with unknown turns. Some routes would ask him to answer cruelty with cruelty, to preempt and punish. Others would ask him to hold the notes he had tucked in his wallet. "Remember why you built this." The narrator, compassionate and steady, knows the truth. The moral shape of a man is not revealed by the cruelty he suffers, but by the way he answers it. Around him, the city breathed on. In small rooms and dark calls, forces rearranged like pieces on a board. Loyalties would break and mend. Secrets would begin to whisper one to another. And somewhere, a plan that had been in motion long before his frosting moment would begin to show its teeth. They ran the audio twice because hope is a slow, polite animal and denial is faster. The clip was short, the scrape of a chair, a cough, then the faint click, and the 3 words, "signal given." At first, it was a ghost of sound, the kind of thing listeners argued about in committee rooms. Then David, the contract engineer Michael, had hired the night before, slowed the waveform and fed it through a cleaner. The whisper sharpened like a knife pulled from wax. Michael felt his chest tighten, as if someone had put their hand there. "Play it again," he said. His voice was small in the glass boardroom. The city glinted beyond like a set of coins. Jonathan sat across from him with his hands folded. He had kept his tie loose, and his eyes hollowed for sleep. The thing about betrayal is that often it looks like exhaustion at first. David clicked the file, and the words landed clean on the air between them. Signal given. The empathetic narrator steps closer. Michael knew the sound of gestures, of small mercies. He had known Jonathan since law school, had shared late-night coffees over contracts that read like prayers. Jonathan had been the man who kept him level when good news arrived too loud and when bad news gnawed at the edges. To hear that voice implicated, if the voice were Jonathan's, made the world tilt in a way that was not about money, but about the quiet architecture of trust. David, careful and neutral, pulled up the voice match. "It's not a perfect match, but the frequency patterns line up," he said. Timbre, cadence. "There's a high probability it's the same speaker." He tapped a file, and a second clip played. Jonathan's recorded remarks at the last board meeting. Comparison overlays lit the screen. The match was cruel in its precision. The impartial narrator records the facts. Probability and evidence are not the same as proof. They still had a step to take. But Michael's hands had gone cold. The betrayal, if true, explained a stanza of events that had been singing in the room since the gala. The man at the edge, the whisper into Emily's ear, the timed press release. Somebody had closed the loop. "Jonathan," Michael said, and the name felt like a plea. If this is a mistake, he let the phrase hang like a thin cloth between them. "Tell me." Jonathan's jaw worked. He did not look away. For a moment his eyes were empty, as if a film had been wiped clean. Then he stood and walked to the window, and the city pressed itself into his silhouette. "I didn't want you to hear it this way," he said finally. His voice broke once, and then stitched itself into a steadier tone. "Mike, you know what Whitman can do. You know how they move." "I thought you were on my side," Michael said. The words were simple and huge. He remembered nights when Jonathan had defended him against predatory board members, when he had sat in the cheap diner with him after a ruling went wrong. He thought of the way Jonathan had told him, once, "We did the right thing," and meant it. Jonathan faced him. "I still am." It was the strangest defense, a man claiming fidelity after the fact. "I told Daniel Price that we needed to test them, that the foundation needed to see where you'd stand under pressure. We set a small scene. We made them nervous so they would talk to us. It was a negotiation tactic, Mike." The voice of the observer notes the logic. Sometimes betrayal wears the coat of strategy. It offers a softer face and asks you to accept calculus where you expected loyalty. But the act itself, setting a trusted leader up for public ridicule, was not a small thing wrapped in a clean justification. Michael's mouth tasted metal. "You staged my humiliation," he said. He tried to keep the accusation steady, to make it a factual thing, not an undone trust. "You set me up in front of cameras and donors and our people. For what? To test Whitman." Jonathan's hands found the back of a chair. He closed his eyes. "To create leverage. To make the move. You wanted them to sign. They were going to stall no matter what." He stopped. The room swallowed the rest. "If you wanted leverage, you could have called them. You could have negotiated. You could have—" Michael's voice caught on a name that had weight. "You could have protected me." The empathetic narrator listens to the old warmth in Michael's memory and knows that what rips is not the plan, but the private promise behind it. A counselor who turns engineer of public humiliation has crossed a line that is not only strategic, but moral. Michael folded his fingers into his lap to stop them from shaking. Jonathan's face changed, not to anger, but to exhaustion. "There were offers on the table," he said. "Don't make me make a list." Whitman was offering a bridge facility in exchange for terms that would preserve a lot for the company. They asked for a signal. I thought, he swallowed, and the word thought trembled. I thought if I engineered a hiccup, we could get the upper hand when they panicked. I thought I could pull it back. I miscalculated. The impartial voice notes how hubris and fear often travel the same road. Acting from fear, dressed as foresight, becomes a kind of betrayal when it is done without consent. Michael's chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with a broken contract. It had to do with the fact that someone he had shared a life with, if only a life of contracts and late-night edits, had put him in the spotlight as a pawn. Silence moved through the room like a cold draft. Michael remembered a dinner from years ago, Jonathan telling him, "We will be better than how the world treats us." That sentence had been a North Star for him then. It now felt small and wavering. Who else knew? Michael asked. The question was the hinge. If others were in it, the architecture of betrayal was wider than one man. Jonathan closed his eyes again. Daniel Price, yes. A couple of Whitman execs. I told Laura because she needed to prepare the numbers. He hesitated. I didn't tell Rachel. I didn't tell the board. I thought it was surgical. Surgical, Michael repeated slowly. You call public humiliation surgical. There was no defense for it then. Jonathan's shoulders sagged. I thought it would be a wake-up call to both sides. I thought. He stopped, and for the first time a rawness cut through his measured voice. I thought if we forced the conversation, we could negotiate from strength. I thought the ends would justify the means. The dual narrator takes a breath and notes the human truth. Men make mistakes when their imagination of the future is more important than the present trust. Jonathan's confession was a map. They now knew the route of the plan. But knowing did not cure the wound. Michael stood and walked to the window. The city spread below, patient and indifferent. He felt both small and enormous, as if the humiliation had been a public thing, but the betrayal had been private and therefore worse. He had built a company out of the bones of long nights, not for his own glory, but for children in neighborhoods who needed schools and parks. The idea that one of his closest allies had treated his dignity as a bargaining chip was a pain that translated into a complex, terrible equation. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, though the answer was already apparent. Why not come to me and say we need to force Whitman's hand? Jonathan met his gaze, and for once the mask fell. Because you would not have agreed. You would have recoiled. You would have called it a cheap trick. You would have told me it would make us morally rotten. You are right. You would have said it's wrong. I thought I could do it for both of us. The confession landed like a stone. It was not the cold bargain of greed. It was the bewildering arrogance of someone who believed they could carry moral compromise for two. The narrator who is kind sees the ache behind Jonathan's rationalization. He had tried to protect a future by breaking a present. Michael's ribs felt like a cage. You carried it for two and broke one of us, he said. The words were not venom. They were a tally. Jonathan exhaled, and the room seemed to hold its breath with him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. The edges were soft from being handled. There are emails, he said. There are texts. I'll hand over everything. I'll step down if you want. I'm sorry, Mike. I thought I was saving us. The observer notes that apologies cannot always repair the architecture of trust, but they are necessary scaffolding for whatever comes next. Michael looked at the envelope, then at the man he had once trusted to catch him. Outside, the day hardened into noon. In that light, Michael felt the shape of a road that could split. One path where he forgave and tried to rebuild, another where the betrayal became a public reckoning. Both paths would cost. He took the envelope with hands that did not tremble. The action was simple and monumental. It was an acceptance of the fact that a wound had been opened, and that he would have to decide how to treat it. He thought of the note in his wallet. Remember why you built this, and how its meaning would now have to include this fracture. The scene closes on a quiet, like a held breath. The twist had landed. The man who had been his counsel had crossed a line and pulled a wire in the room where Michael trusted to stand steady. The next choice would determine whether that trust could be repaired, whether a company built on a dream of community could survive a private storm made public, and whether Michael himself could find a way to answer betrayal without losing the moral center he had fought to keep. The days that followed moved like a tide, slow, inevitable, and full of debris. News feeds thickened with the gala clip, and though the story had begun as a brief, biting laugh, it refused to die. Morning shows replayed the smear in slow motion. Late-night hosts turned it into a punchline. The numbers behind those laughs were not funny. Calls came in that had nothing to do with sympathy. Investors asking for assurances, vendors pressing for clarity, a partner asking if contracts should be paused. Viridian was suddenly a headline, and headlines have teeth. Michael woke each morning with the same small ritual. He touched the scar on his brow like a boy testing a tide mark, and then reached for the note in his wallet. Remember why you built this. The words were a steadying thing in a room full of noisy demands. But steadying does not equal easy. Each day the moral crossroad glowed more clearly. Expose Jonathan and risk collapsing the deal and the company, or protect the company and swallow the betrayal whole. Neither choice felt clean. Jonathan kept his offer to step down close in his hands like a softened coin. He came to the office and sat across from Michael with a face that told the man who had tried to hold a storm at bay. "I'll sign anything you want," he said, voice thin as paper. "I'll hand over the files. I'll take the fall if that's what you need." Michael watched him for a long time. The man's confession had been grave, but it had also been honest in a way that left him raw. "Why did you think you could carry this?" Michael asked finally. The question was not legal, it was personal. "Why make me the instrument of a plan you thought was necessary?" Jonathan swallowed. "Because you are principled in a way that makes people hesitate," he said. "I thought if I could break the hesitation, we could save the company. I thought I could protect the mission by dirtying my hands, not yours." The room hummed with the unspoken. You had the right to choose your burden. Michael folded his hands and thought of the communities Viridian aimed to serve. If Whitman withdrew and the deal collapsed, people would lose jobs and schools would lose promised funding. If he exposed the plot and took down those who engineered it, he risked the slow work he had built. He had to weigh guilt against duty, justice against consequence. The balance felt like a live wire. Outside the boardroom, Laura moved like a surgeon on a clock. "We prepare contingency plans," she told the team. "We talk to existing lenders. We talk to potential bridge financiers. We craft a message that is honest but not self-destructive." Her sentences landed like calculated steps. "Michael, if Whitman pulls entirely, we can survive, but it will be painful. We need to know if you want to fight in the open or keep this internal." "I want to save the company and the people who work for it," Michael said. Saying it aloud made the decision heavier. He pictured the maintenance staff in the community center they had promised to renovate, the single mothers who counted on a steady paycheck, the interns who had been offered a future. Public justice felt righteous. Private pragmatism felt necessary. Rachel called in the middle of one long night. Her voice was simple and fierce. "You can't let them teach you to answer evil with the same coin," she said. "But you also can't let your ethics kill the people who depend on you." She didn't hand him an answer. She handed him the tension he needed to live inside for a while and find his own way. Then there was the moral architecture of leadership. The board wanted facts, the employees wanted reassurance, and the public wanted scandal. The emails in Jonathan's envelope had been damning enough to prove orchestration. Texts with Daniel Price, emails that showed planned press rotation. But the emails also showed the Whitman offer, a conditional bridge loan that would have kept operations afloat if Whitman's terms were met. The deal had strings that would bring Whitman into the executive fold in ways Michael had not imagined. The same hand that had staged the humiliation had offered a lifeline. one wrapped in control. That fact lodged in him like a thorn. If he accepted the lifeline, he paid a price in independence. If he refused, he might sacrifice people who had no hand in the plan. The boardroom became a kiln of hard choices. Moral purity versus the binding real needs of flesh and work. Pressure built from another direction, public trust. Emily and the Whitman Foundation did not retreat. Her public statements softened into a language of caution and values. But behind the words there was a steady campaign of reassessment that kept investors jittery. An anonymous op-ed floated into the New York feed questioning Viridian's governance. And even when it read like rumor, it cut. The company's social accounts are filled with sympathetic comments, and also with people deciding whether to take their money elsewhere. Michael watched each new notification like a man watching a small fire lick at a dry field. Inside Viridian, employees moved through the day with eyes that had learned paranoia. Laura tried to keep the daily operations on a steady keel, assigning tasks and visiting teams. But even she had to admit how fragile the situation felt. "We must prepare for both outcomes," she told Michael quietly. "Prepare to continue alone and prepare to negotiate terms with Whitman if we can secure constraints that protect our mission." "Can we protect the mission?" Michael asked the question, a small, fierce thing. "We can try," Laura said. "But it will require ironclad covenants, independent boards for the community projects, and legal oversight." She looked at him like someone who had seen too many slides of red ink. "You need to decide how far you're willing to compromise." Meanwhile, someone had been watching the edges of the map. A leak surfaced, documents that suggested Jonathan had not acted alone. The emails included an outside consultant's signature and a note that a media firm would be instructed to time the release. The document made the story smell of conspiracy rather than a single cowardly regret. Michael read it under the fluorescent lights of his office and felt a new cold. If there were more hands, then exposing one man would only peel a thin layer from a rot that could run deeper. He confronted Jonathan about the leak. "Who else?" he asked. Jonathan's face fell into a tired honesty. "There might be others," he admitted, "but I don't know them all. Daniel had connections. I didn't meet everyone on their side." His answer was small and frightening. A betrayal is always worse when it stretches like a net. Then there was the private voice at night, the unknown text that had asked him if he wanted to play fair. It came again, this time with a single line. "Some things are necessary." The messages arrived from numbers he could not trace. They read as threats and as temptations. They promised consequences if he did not move quickly and offered safety if he did what they wanted. Michael kept those messages like a bruise under his ribs. A crisis meeting with the board was called. Faces he had known for years appeared sober, almost clinical. The chairman's question was simple. "Do you want us to pursue a legal action or a negotiated path?" The board's options read like medical triage. Lawsuits might expose more and break more. Negotiation might preserve some lives, but on terms he could not fully predict. The weight of the decision was centrifugal. In the quiet after the meeting, Michael walked to the terrace. Night had fallen, and the city was a field of low, breathing lights. He thought of the frosting like a small, absurd mark that had become an earthquake line. He thought of Jonathan's apology and the envelope that might be a map to more. He thought of the maintenance man who had cried when he spoke of the company's promised community garden. More than the money or the humiliation, the costs were human. The narrator shifts, more intimate. Choices like the one he faced separate the leaders from their myths. Michael felt himself reshaping. He could be the kind of leader who closed ranks to protect an idea, or the kind who tore ranks open to expose a wrong. Both demanded sacrifice. Both risked losing the thing he loved. He put his palm to the cool stone of the terrace wall and let the stillness press into him. He did not yet have the words to answer the board, to promise the employees, to respond to the anonymous texts. But the city below moved on, indifferent and relentless. He felt the truth settle into him, not as an answer, but as the hard fact of consequence. He would have to choose, and whatever he chose would ripple. The cake and the laughter had been small. The world's response would not be. The real test had nothing to do with cameras. It had to do with what he would be willing to trade and what he would hold as inviolable. They called the emergency meeting for noon, when light cuts hardest through glass and every shadow is honest. The boardroom at Whitman Tower felt like a stage built to swallow men whole, a long table of polished walnut, high-back chairs that seemed designed to place people under inspection, and a wall of windows that showed the city as a patient audience. Cameras clustered near the door, news crews, bored videographers, live stream gear. An audience of 1,000 eyes ready to watch the detonations. Michael walked in with a folder and the thin, steady weight of the envelope Jonathan had given him. The air smelled faintly of coffee and expensive leather. He could feel his heart in the hollow by his throat, the body's old, honest alarm. He had rehearsed nothing. Rehearsal felt like a performance that would cheapen truth. Jonathan met him at the head of the table. His face carried the usual lines of a man who had done hard work, but now the lines had been carved deeper by guilt. Laura sat 2 seats over, tidy and composed in a way that had once comforted Michael. Tonight, she had the look of someone holding knowledge like a separate life. Rachel stood at the back with her arms folded, eyes bright with a steadiness that steadied him. Across from him sat Richard Whitman, stone-faced and smooth as a marble column, and his daughter, Emily, pale and precise, looking like someone who had been taught to measure every expression. Charles Mercer, the longtime chairman and a man with a smile that had once felt like an ally, sat to Richard's left. He kept his hands folded like a judge holding a verdict. Daniel Price leaned in the doorway, too thin for the role he had played. Michael set the envelope on the table. The whisper of paper was louder than he expected. He drew a breath and said simply, "I want all of us to hear what happened." He played the audio first, the cleaned clip Jonathan's team had isolated. The room picked up the tiny click and then the faint, deadly words, "Signal given." The sound moved like a blade through the air. Heads turned. Some mouths went slack. The journalists by the windows straightened their microphones. Then he slid the emails across the table. Screens lit up. There were the texts between Jonathan and Daniel. There were the media firm contracts. There were the staged press release drafts. Each message was a small, precise instrument. The evidence assembled like a portrait of intention rather than accident. Jonathan stood then, and the room tilted. He did not speak to obfuscate. He told the truth with the brutal economy of someone who had finally run out of excuses. He admitted his part, described his calculations, named Daniel Price as the man who had coordinated the PR timing, and then, voice cracking, looked at Laura. "I told Laura so she could prepare our communications," he said. The name hung there, and all eyes came to her. Laura's face moved as if through an internal geography. She folded her hands and said measuredly, "I was preparing contingency language. I also," she stopped. For a beat, she looked like a woman who had been waiting to be seen. "I opened talks with Whitman privately," she said. The phrase landed like a second hammer blow. "I thought if I could secure terms that limited Whitman's control, we could protect operations. I did not tell Michael because I thought it would start a fight we could not survive." Silence swallowed them. Betrayal, when it arrives, is not loud at first. It is a small fissure that opens into a canyon. Jonathan's confession explained the staging. Laura's admission explained why Whitman's letters had been so smooth, why the bridge loan looked tender and also binding. She had tried to bargain away autonomy while keeping jobs safe. The moral trade she had made was enormous and private. Michael felt each word like weather, hot, sharp, changing the landscape of people's faces. He thought of the workers, the interns, the kids in the after-school program. He thought of the garden they had promised. Laura had acted to protect them, she said, and in doing so had cut a seam in the company he had tried to build. Then Emily stood. He had expected anger or a cold dismissal. Instead, she walked to the window, as if getting air, and then turned to face the room in a way that felt like stepping into a new role. Her voice was low, but when she spoke, the microphones leaned in. "You all heard what was done here," she said. "My father and Charles thought a public push would make the company bend. They thought the panic would make Michael compromise." Her eyes found Richard's and then Charles's. They wanted control. They wanted seats on the councils that run the projects. They wanted to run the community programs themselves. "I did not sign off on the cake. I did not sign off on public humiliation." She paused. "But I did not tell them to stop." The room exhaled. Richard's face didn't move at first. Charles shifted, the old smile thinning. Emily's words were a second, surprising turn, the first twist of the confrontation. She was not merely a spoiled heiress throwing a joke. She had been an instrument of a family plan, and now she would not be its cover. She went further, speaking with the kind of concrete calm that reconfigured the stakes. "I have emails," she said. "I have messages that show meetings where my father discussed conditional terms that would allow Whitman to appoint a controlling seat if Viridian's leadership faltered. I did not agree to this. I will not be the instrument of that hand." She set a folder on the table, a quiet, decisive echo of Michael's. "If you want Whitman's money, it must come with safeguards independent of family control. No seats binding our community boards. Independent oversight. Full transparency." Her betrayal of her family's plan was a turning of the knife in a different direction. For the first time, the room saw that power was fracturing inside Whitman, not only being wielded outside. The cameras shifted, hungry for the drama of a daughter breaking from her father. Richard rose then, voice large and angry. "This is theater," he said. "You are playing games. The foundation wants responsible guardianship." Emily cut him off. "You call it guardianship. I call it control. If you want to help, do it without commandeering the work." Charles, who had been the quiet architect behind several conservative moves on the board for years, tried to salvage sway. He produced a ledger and a line item, an accusation that Michael had pushed some expenditures forward without explicit board authorization. He framed it like a scandal that could justify a forced restructuring. The room tensed, lawyers shuffled. It was a countermove, an old money's knife. Michael felt the world narrow to one breath. He could fight Charles on accounting minutiae, but every long battle cost time and public faith. The cameras recorded every fissure. The choice was a crucible. Win now by muddying everything, or win a better way by exposing truth and accepting pain. He asked for time to speak, and when he did, the quieter narrator moved in. He spoke not of numbers, but of people. The janitor whose son read under the glow of donated lamps. The teacher whose curriculum would be cut if funds shifted. The neighborhood that had waited for a playground. He let his voice carry those small faces into the room of polished wood and old alliances. He did not shout. He did not plead. He told truths the way one lights candles in a dark room, one by one. When he finished, Rachel stepped forward. She had kept quiet until now. Her voice was steady. "I've been looking into the conditional offers," she said. "I found clauses that would insert the foundation into governance in ways we cannot afford. I also found evidence that someone on this board intended to leverage that clause to obtain seats for their own investments." Her eyes found Charles. "I'm giving these to the auditors." The auditors, who had sat politely in the corner, suddenly leaned forward like men unaccustomed to being surprised. Papers rustled. The portrait of the plan changed shape again, now a net of interests that had been tied together quietly for years. Charles's face, once confident, now showed a strain his smile could not hide. The cameras were no longer just watching. They were holding the room to the light. Reporters scribbled. Lawyers whispered into sleeves. The momentum had shifted from a private smear to public accountability. Richard, seeing the room turn, blinked. He had not expected Emily's defection, nor Rachel's quiet investigations. He looked at his daughter, then at the ledger, then at Michael. For a moment the patriarch's armor slid. "This is not how I intended it," he said, small and human for the first time. "I wanted to protect what we give." Emily's voice softened. "Then protect it without owning it." The votes that followed were painfully procedural. The board convened an independent audit, named an emergency oversight committee with members drawn from outside Whitman influence, and required that any financing offers be written with covenants that preserved Viridian's, community boards, and independence. Jonathan offered his resignation and then, after a long look at Michael, asked to stay only as an advisor with no executive authority. Laura stepped back from negotiations. She would remain as CFO under strict oversight. It was not a clean victory. No fight like that ever is. Charles's seat was put on hold pending further review. Richard's foundation announced a pause in immediate financial commitments pending the audit. News cameras labeled the day as chaos. Michael felt it as a cleansing. Emily's choice had cost her a family's favor and, in the ledger of public life, had remade her image. When the meeting ended, the city's light had turned honey gold. Michael stepped out onto a narrow balcony, the world below humming as if nothing had happened. He pressed his hand to the cool metal rail and let the dusk settle. The narrator who loved him knelt in the quiet of that moment. He had exposed betrayal and preserved the mission, not by mimicry of cruelty, but by choosing truth and the slow machinery of law. Jonathan came and stood at a pace behind him. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was small. "I thought I was buying time," he said. "I thought." Michael put a hand on his shoulder. It was neither absolution nor condemnation. "You broke trust," he said. "But you also tried to keep people safe in the way you understood. There will be consequences." The lights of the city blinked on, patient and indifferent, and Michael felt the weight of what had been done and what remained. The truths had been revealed. The world would take its hours to judge them. He had, in that room of walnut and glass, chosen a way forward that asked for repair rather than revenge. The choice did not make everything whole. It did, for the first time in a long sequence of small humiliations and secret bargains, open the possibility of something honest. The weeks after the hearing moved with a new rhythm, less frantic, more deliberate. Auditors came and went like winter birds, taking papers and leaving behind clearer air. The Independent Oversight Committee did its work with a slow, clean insistence, and each finding was a small, bright stone that Michael set into the structure he had promised his neighborhoods. The cameras still circled sometimes, but the story lost its taste for scandal and found a taste for detail. Covenants, trustees, clauses. Detail is the place where repair takes shape. Whitman's response was the oddest thing. Public restraint followed by private pressure. Richard Whitman, bruised in the light of his daughter's defection, agreed to pause any immediate takeover plans. Emily, who had once wiped frosting across Michael's face and then watched the room rearrange, surprised everyone by doing something almost reckless. She used her voice inside the family to insist that any money given to Viridian must not buy control. There was a day in late autumn when Michael sat alone in his office, and an envelope arrived with no logo. Inside was a brief note in Emily's handwriting. It said, simply, "I want to help. Call me." He could have refused. Many men would have and would have been justified. But he didn't. Instead, he called. 2 weeks later, in a small, unadorned room with a pot of coffee between them, Emily spoke without the polished laugh that had once sent the gala into a particular orbit. "I was cruel," she said. "Not because it was funny, but because I thought shock would force good outcomes. Your dignity." She paused and looked at him like a child stepping out of costume. "I am sorry." She meant it in a manner that made it less theatrical and more dangerous. She meant it with the real risk of change. She had forced her father into a reckoning, and, in that pressure, she had helped open a door. Whitman Holdings, under Emily's insistence and public discomfort, offered a new package. A $4 billion commitment structured as a charitable endowment and a series of conditional grants, not a controlling buyout. The money would fund Viridian's projects, while independent trustees, nominated by community groups and approved by an outside panel, would safeguard governance. The offer was staggering. The board dialed into an emergency call. Jonathan watched with hollowed eyes from the sidelines, a man now reduced from architect of a plot to a penitent official. Laura ran the numbers until her eyes stung. Rachel kept quiet and then finally said the thing that steadied him. This is an opportunity. Don't make it an excuse. Michael found himself weighing more than numbers. He weighed faces. The janitor whose son would finally have a proper scholarship fund. The teacher who had sketched a curriculum for the new community center. The families who had watched promises arrive like distant weather. He also weighed the sanctity of the work. No one could make promises to the poor and then hand their futures to those who had never lived in their streets. It would have been easy to demand purity in a world that rarely offers it. It would have been easy, too, to refuse and break the lives hanging on small, daily income. The choice narrowed into something clean. Accept money with strict ironclad protections, or refuse and let good things fall because of one man's arrogance or one family's hunger. He wanted both justice and effect. He knew now, felt in his bones, that the two rarely come as a single neat thing. They negotiated terms until a frosty night when the city's lights were small and cautious. Emily pushed her father hard. She pushed the trustees' clause, the independent audits, the guarantees that community boards could veto appointments that would affect program design. Richard fought, as fathers do when their image and plans feel taken from them, but he also listened in a way that aged him. There was stubbornness and compromise until there was a document that would not be perfect, but would be durable. Jonathan offered his resignation publicly and accepted a role as a consultant for a limited period. No executive control, no handling of funds, partly in penance, and partly because he still knew the legal scaffolding of what had to be done. The board held him accountable, and there were hearings and statements and quiet apologies that felt like a balm on a fresh wound. Laura stayed under new oversight and worked to prove that numbers could be made to honor people rather than subsume them. When the foundation announced the new plan for $1 billion committed, bound to trustees, and a covenant protecting Viridian's community boards, the headline read a dozen different things in a dozen tones. Some called it a victory for transparency. Others said it was an ugly compromise. Michael read them all and folded them away like old letters. He felt something heavier than the lines of a headline, a steadying obligation. The first project funded from the new endowment opened in spring. A playground rose on a plot of land that had been a weed patch for decades. A library, its shelves low and welcoming, hummed with children. A maintenance team that had once feared layoffs now had secure contracts. The ribbon they cut was cheap plastic and unglamorous, but when the first ball bounced across the new concrete, it sounded like something repaired. On the day the playground opened, Michael stood at the edge and watched children run. He had a smear of dirt on his finger from the garden bed his team had planted weeks earlier. A quiet narrator, tender now, moves close. He thought of the frosting more than once, and not because it had been a moment of humiliation, but because it had been the first public crack that revealed deep rot. The frosting had been a small truth. Sometimes the world's cruelties are staged. Sometimes they reveal larger cruelties. What mattered was what you did next. He walked through the rows of swings and benches, past parents laughing at other parents, past a teacher reading a story aloud. A small boy ran up and handed him a drawing, a scribble of a building with trees, and the words "thank you" in big, clumsy letters. Michael held the paper like a relic. Rachel, beside him, squeezed his hand and said nothing. Emily stood a few yards away, watching, not with triumph, but with a cautious sort of peace. Later that night, Michael sat alone on his terrace, the city unspooling below. He opened the small note in his wallet. "Remember why you built this?" And he read it slowly. He had wanted to save a community, but had been forced to learn what the cost of leadership could be. That sometimes you must endure humiliation and betrayal and still choose the path that saves others. He had learned to forgive without forgetting, to hold people accountable, and still keep the door open for repair. He had learned that moral purity could not be a luxury when other people's lives hung in the balance. He thought of Jonathan, of the man who had tried to carry a burden that was never his alone. He thought of Laura, who had bent a rule to protect wages and then had been forced to admit the price of that bending. He thought of Emily, who had thrown a slice of cake and then, in a different courage, had tried to undo what her family had begun. None of them were holy villains or holy saints. They were people learning, under pressure, how to be honest with themselves. The city breathed on. The endowment would not fix every wound. There would be audits and lawsuits and resentments. But there would also be roofs over heads and books in small hands, and a playground where once there had been only grit. Michael felt the tension between victory and cost tighten into a strand that could carry forward. He folded the drawing the boy had given him and put it into his pocket next to the faded note. In the dark, with the city's hum as a lullaby, he let himself dream small and steady dreams, the kind that could be built if one kept choosing repair over revenge and work over spectacle. The moral had not been simple, nor had the ending. It was, as life often is, a beginning disguised as an ending, messy, human, and, if he guarded it well, true. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.